Oh, okay. Got to do that. You write it down and come in. I'll answer it. There we go. We got 1 or 2 minutes. I want to elaborate. I gave you a 1-point answer, and now I have a 4-point answer. All right? Don't worry, it's not like a 4-point message. It's just, it's just, this is pretty quick. But, we could start. I don't, are we on? Are we going? All right, cool. Oh yeah, wait. I'll do this now. Let's look at Genesis chapter 4. That's where our answer is found for the most part. Genesis 4. So the question is why did God not? We're talking about at one point we're talking about the institution of government in Genesis chapter 9, and that was on the issue of capital punishment for the crime of murder. And off of that, we surmise that if God has entrusted man to carry out the most severe punishment for the most severe crime, then it's only logical that God is authorizing man to carry out lesser punishments for lesser crime. And there's a logical thought process there. But then the question was, well, why did God allow Cain to live after he killed Abel? And of course, my answer was basically kind of two-part. I'll just give you my answer. First, the punishment that Cain did receive was pretty severe. If we look at Genesis 4, all right, and I want you to look at first verse 2, and I'm in Genesis 3, that'll be a problem. Genesis 4, all right, and she again bare his brother Abel. Abel was a keeper of the sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Okay, so what was Cain's livelihood? He was a farmer. He farmed, okay? Now, in part of the punishment of Cain, drop down to verse number 12. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. Okay, what did God do here? Took away his livelihood. The one thing that the thing he was very good at, God said, you're done. Now, men work most of their lives, and there is much statistical analysis that shows that when men have nothing to work for, they die. All right? A lot of men die when they retire. The ones that don't is because they're going into something else. They're retired from their job, but they're involved in their church. They're not just sitting around all day. All right? The ones that are active, that are doing things, they go on. The men who don't die. It's a statistic you can research. God says, I'm taking away your livelihood. But here's the difference. You're not going to die. And I'm not going to let anybody kill you. This is why, verse 13, and Cain said unto the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. I have no purpose, no function. You're taking away the only thing that I do well. And on top of that, I'm exiled. So I'm not going to see my mom or my dad anymore. And so this punishment was very difficult for him. And verse 14, behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, from the face shall I be hid. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth, and it shall come to pass that everyone that find me shall slay me. And the Lord said unto him, Therefore whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. God said, no one's going to kill you. No, you're just going to be a wandering vagabond for the rest of your life. So, secondly, I want you to see God also had plans for Cain, at least his lineage. Look at verse 20. And Ada bare Jabal, he was the father of such that dwell in tents, and of such that have cattle, and his name was Jubal. And his brother's name was Jubal, and he was the father of all that such handled the harp and the organ. And Zillah, she also bare Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artifice and brass and iron. The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naaman. All right. So what we see here is these are the descendants of Cain, and they start to develop some things that we use today. And the knowledge that these people developed are still around today. You have, people working with brass and iron and music and harp and organ. And this is information that Noah would have known that goes back to them, that he took with him on the ark along with his family. And when they got up, they maybe didn't have all the materials, but they knew how to do it, and they could teach in their descendants. And these things came back very quickly because the knowledge was already there. God wanted this knowledge to be developed, and it was the descendants of Cain that did bring it out. Thirdly, I did mention this, there weren't a lot of people on the earth at that time. And so you start, killing people, you're not going in the right direction. Now, at that time, all right, we come to Genesis 9, and that's quite a bit of time later, even though it's not that much space in the Bible. It is quite a bit of time later. And so obviously God now institutes the death penalty for the crime of murder. And so there's a couple of things to consider here. Cain would have had no knowledge of the concept that he could lose his life for taking a life. How would he ever think that? God hadn't communicated that. Does God hold us accountable for what we don't know? Not really. I mean, yes, we're accountable to certain things, but God is not going to hold someone accountable for unrevealed knowledge. That's not his nature. Secondly, here's another thought to think about this. Cain was angry at Abel. But had there ever been a murder before? No. So is the concept, I'm going to end this person's life, he would have no frame of reference. In other words, I'm angry at you, I'm going to take this rock and hit you with it because I don't like you. Did he know it would kill him? I don't know, because no one had ever died before. So that concept of death, in the physical sense, would not have been on their minds. And they knew animals could die, so maybe there's some correlation there, but a human being had never died. And so you don't know the intent there, but I'm intending to do something that's never been done before. Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe it was just rage, and the result was death. And we don't know. So would God kill somebody for something that they didn't know was one day going to be punishable by death? No, I don't think he would, because it's not in his nature. He hadn't revealed that yet. And then there's a question of what did Cain actually know, and what was the intent? Clearly, there was anger and hatred. That right there is evident. But was the intent to murder him? Possibly. But there again, he's attempting to do something that's never been done before, that maybe he didn't even know if it could be done. So, and then lastly, think about this, and I'll back up on this thought of why didn't he kill him? Well, as we continue on, and we come to verse 23 of Genesis 4, and Lamech, and this is a descendant of his as well, Lamech said unto his wives, Ada and Zillah, Hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech, for I have slain a man to my wounding, a young man to my hurt. But now you got a descendant of yours who's killing people and proud of it. And by the way, you don't know who the man was. Maybe that was another descendant. You ever have kids that, adults, you ever have kids or grandkids that don't get along, don't like each other? That will rip your heart apart. You ever have kids that do things as adults that disappoint you? That's difficult. He has to watch it. So why didn't he kill him? There's a lot of reasons, and it wasn't a pleasant experience for him. So that's my answer, all right? And now, back to our study. And so quickly to review, we're talking about what is the purpose of government. We're talking about biblical principles concerning government. And we talked about last week that government should punish evil and reward good, all right? Punish evil and reward good. I wrote a few notes just to recap down, and I wrote punish good and reward evil. And I almost read it, and I was like, wait, that's not right. And so I'm glad I'm paying attention to what I actually say here. But we looked at Genesis chapter 9 and saw that God gave man the authority to carry out capital punishment, and this reduces anarchy, because we talked about anarchy is the most destructive evil, and that God created government to execute justice and defend the weak. We found that in the Old Testament. We went through and parsed that all out. In the New Testament, we started in on Romans chapter 13, and there we saw in the first two verses that God appointed those that are in power. So everybody who has a governmental position, God has ordained them to be there, and that these are civil rulers that are meant to be terror to bad, according to verse 3, and to promote those who do good. We also found in verse number 4 that government officials serve God, all right? That they are servants of the Lord. So let's go back to Romans chapter 13 here in the New Testament, and we'll pick up where we left off, Romans chapter 13. Romans 13. All right. And so we'll just review here verse 1. Let every soul be subject unto higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have the praise of the same. For he, the ruler, the government official, is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. So what I want you to see now, kind of picking up where we left off, government authorities execute God's wrath on wrongdoers and thereby carry out the task of retribution. Paul says here that rulers do not bear the sword in vain, but they are the revenger to execute wrath upon evildoers. Now, the word revenger here means an agent of punishment. Now, in other words, derivatives of this word are translated vengeance. All right, so this indicates that the purpose of civil government is not only to prevent further wrongdoing, but it is also to carry out God's wrath on wrongdoing. Okay, so, and I'm going to get this out of the way. I don't think we're using it anymore. So, not only do they prevent wrongdoing, but they carry out judgment, God's wrath on wrongdoing. This indicates that the purpose of civil government, this also includes bringing actual punishment, some kind of pain or hardship to the wrongdoer. A punishment that is appropriate with the crime that is committed. And this is significant, especially in connection with Romans 12, verse 9. Go back to Romans 12 and look at verse 9. 19. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Now, how many have heard that verse? Right? Now, how many understood that that verse is on the heels of three verses later. He starts talking about government that is what? In verse number 4, the revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. All right? So just a few verses later, in the same context, really, what God is saying, listen, you don't need to avenge yourself. God will avenge you. Oh, and by the way, he'll probably use your local government to do it. All right? And it's right there in its context that the government will issue punishment for wrongdoing. Paul tells Christians not to take personal vengeance when wrong has been done to them, that they should rather allow the wrongdoer to be punished by the wrath of God, and that means that it is often right for the Christian to turn to civil government to ask for justice to be done when they've suffered wrongdoing at the hands of others. And civil government in this life is the means that God has established to carry out justice. God will deal with eternal justice. But in this life, God has ordained government to carry out justice. So in other words, if someone does you wrong, call the police. There's nothing unchristian about calling the police when there's wrong going on. All right? You know, when we had the idiot next door over here, I shouldn't call him that, but that's what he was. I hope he gets saved. Not Nick. I know. I was just like, wait a minute. I want to clarify because, you know, people may not understand. We didn't own this house always, and there was somebody who really gave our church. We had really good neighbors. We've had, including Nick, we've had 4 different neighbors over there, and 3 of them have been awesome. But we had one, man, that was just really, really difficult. And I did everything I could to make this guy happy, and he basically threatened to destroy some of our property. So I called the police. I said, what do you mean by that? He says, I mean exactly what you think I mean. I said, all right. So I called the police. I had no other recourse. Now, I went many steps to avoid that, but when all my steps were rejected, why? That's what they're there for. Okay? And I called them. I said, yeah, this guy. And they said, what's his name? And I said, this guy. And he goes, oh, I know that guy. He's a jerk. What he said. And he said, don't worry, he won't bother you again. Never did. Never did. And I felt bad for his wife, though. She'd come out every now and then and just talk about how much of a jerk her husband was. I'm pretty sure there was some stuff going on there. But anyhow, look, that's what they're there for. You have problems, you utilize them. Now, let's go over to 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2. I know we've covered these verses before, kind of just looking at them in a different light. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 and 14. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 and 14. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king or as supreme, or unto governors as unto them that are sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of them that do well. So Peter has a very similar view as Paul does on government. Peter, like Paul, begins with the command to subject or to submit yourself to every ordinance of man. So, and whoever the ruler of the land is. He also says that they are to restrain bad conduct and to give praise and encouragement to good conduct. So he's saying basically the same thing here, that the Bible is teaching this is the biblical role of government. Stop evil, promote good. And that you see that consistent teaching throughout the Bible. And so the idea of government being established by God is not made explicit in this passage, but it is hinted at when Peter says that Christians are to submit themselves for what reason? Verse 13? For the Lord's sake. All right? For the Lord's sake. Peter included the idea of retribution against wrongdoers when he says governors are to punish those who do evil, and that they should praise those who do good and give additional support to the goal of promoting the common good of a society. That's what government's supposed to do, promote the common good of a society. And Now, let's answer some questions. What about turning the other cheek, as in Matthew 5:39? Now, we talked about some of this before, but it's good to review a few things in case you missed it. What about when it says we should turn the other cheek? Some Christians strongly object to the idea that government should punish wrongdoers. They say that government should instead try to correct the causes that led to a person committing a crime. And we'd see a lot with that. Well, it was their upbringing, so we got to fix their upbringing, and then if we fix their upbringing, they'll be better. If we give them a better environment, they'll be better. No, that's not what God says they're to do. God says you punish those who do wrong, and you reward those who do good, not rehabilitate those that do wrong. Now, I'm not against teaching people to do right, by the way, because that is promoting good. Okay? So don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But what I am saying is, don't just excuse sinful conduct. That's what we're getting at here. Blaming society for much more, we should never blame society more than we blame the person who did the wrong. And we see that too much. People not taking personal accountability and blaming their circumstances, their upbringing, society as a whole. You cannot blame society more than the individual. I'm not saying certain things in society don't factor in. They do. But such people often appeal to Jesus' statement in Matthew 5:39 about turning the other cheek. Now, the question is, does this verse prohibit government from executing punishment on wrongdoers? Not when it's rightly understood. The turn the other cheek verse should be understood within its proper context. Here, Jesus is not talking about the responsibilities of government, but is giving principles for individual personal conduct. In addition, in this section of Matthew, Jesus is not giving absolute requirements that must be followed in every instance, but rather is giving a specific, concrete illustration of what personal conduct will often look like in the life of a Christian. In other words, when you receive an insult, all right, which is what a slap to the face is, it's an insult. It stings, it hurts, but it's not going to kill you. Jesus says, turn the other cheek. What is that? It's gracious. All right? It's not having a slap fight. Oh, you slap me? I'll slap you. All right? It's not having a slap fight. It's you are insulted. It stings, it hurts. You don't like it. But you're not going to retaliate. But instead be gracious and say, hey, if you want to keep hurting and insulting me, go right ahead. That's your choice. But I'm not going to be like you. I'm not going to retaliate, because then I'm no better than you. That's what Jesus is getting at. So, if we, that's not saying government can't punish people. It's two totally different things. Let's give you another example. It would be disobedient to the rest of Scripture to obey in every situation, because the command comes just 3 verses later in Matthew 5, verse 42. Give to him that asketh of thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn thou not away. Now, if we don't take into account context and scenario and situation, if we just follow that as what we have to do in every scenario, well, you're going to run into some problems. Why? Well, do you realize that every beggar could bankrupt you if you had to follow that passage to a T with no concept of context? In other words, if a homeless person came to you and said, yeah, I need some money. No, I need all your money now. Well, if we're going to follow this to a T without looking at the context, we'd have to give it to him. Or we'd be not following Jesus. Of course, none of us believe that's what it is. Because why? That would be invalidating the concepts of being a good steward. All right? Also, it would be invalidating concepts and principles of, well, what is this money going towards? In other words, am I helping a drug addict buy more drugs? Or if I'm genuinely helping the person, okay, I can help them, but if I'm just giving them cash so they can go buy alcohol, am I helping that person, or am I enabling them? I'm enabling them. I'm helping them to sin. Jesus would never want us to help someone to sin. So I'm saying you have to take into account context, all right, and in the leadership of the Holy Spirit. Now, for these reasons, Jesus' command to turn the other cheek is not a persuasive argument against governmental use of force or retribution and punishment on wrongdoers. Now, there should be civil governments, there would be civil governments even in a sinless world. Would there be sinless governments even in a sinless world? Governments, well, people say, well, there's only, would there be government? Well, think about this. Will there be government in the millennial kingdom? Yes, there will. Will the world be sinful as it is today? No, it won't. All right? Much of the sin in the world today will be eradicated, but there will still be government to what? Promote the common good of society. Well, what are they going to do? Well, build roads, regulation of, I don't know how it's going to be in the millennial kingdom. What I do know is there'll still be people just like you and I, and they're going to need to travel, and there's going to be guidelines that you follow. How about establishment of weights and measures? Do you ever wonder what is the weight system we're going to be using in the millennial kingdom, all right? And how are we going to measure things? Is it going to be, inches? Or is he going metric? I don't know, is it going to be pounds or kilograms? I'm thinking kilograms, all right? I'm thinking, but I don't know. Maybe it'll be, shekels. I'm not sure. I have no idea, but there will be a weight and measurement system. And who will decide what that is going to be? The government, which will be Jesus, so it'll be the best measurement system you've ever thought of. But maintenance of public records, establishment of laws for safety, standardizing electrical power, establishment of currency to be used as money. How we don't even know. How's that all going to work? We have no idea. We don't know the nuances of the millennial kingdom, but we do know we will reign with Him, indicating authority within Christ's kingdom and government. So there will always be government of some sort because it's ordained of God. Now, what about the detailed laws given to Israel found in Exodus through Deuteronomy? Because there's a lot of detail, a lot of laws in there. And so let's consider this. If it's true that governments are responsible before God to punish evil and encourage good, then we should not, follow me, if we believe that, then we should not look to the extensive laws that God gave to the nation of Israel in the Old Testament to find out how government should function in detail. We can't do this directly, and we can only do it with much difficulty. Why? Because of the special place those laws occupy in the scope of the whole Bible. Look, the Old Testament books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy record many laws that God gave specifically for the nation of Israel. These laws belong to what is called the Mosaic Covenant, which was between God and Israel. This is where it blows my mind when people get into replacement theology and start thinking that the church is Israel. Well, hold up now. Now you're opening up a can of worms. Because if the church is Israel, then shouldn't we be following the laws that God gave to the nation of Israel? And if that's true, then we got a lot of problems. And you know what? Not one of them think that one through. But because God gave the laws to Moses, and Moses gave them to the people, understanding exactly how Israel's laws might possibly be relevant to a secular civil government today is a very complex question for several reasons. Well, first you have the why. Well, why is it complex? Well, first you have the place of Israel. The proper interpretation of Israel's laws requires a mature understanding of the place of the nation of Israel in the history of the Bible. And what was God's purpose for Israel in the history of the world? Think about this. Israel was basically a theocracy. Who knows what a theocracy is? Who can tell me? Rick. One ruler. Who's who? God. Okay. Are we a theocracy? No, we're not. Now, the millennial kingdom will be a theocracy, okay? But we're not a theocracy. Now, why? Well, for one, there's nobody who's God to rule. That's the big problem, all right? But proper interpretation of Israel's laws also requires a realization that Israel was unique. It was to be for God a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. It was a theocracy ruled by God himself. Therefore, the laws of Israel governed the religious life of God's people, such as the sacrifices, the festivals, and their worship of the one true God, as well as matters that ordinarily belong to all civil governments in all ages of history. I mean, they have building codes there in the Bible, okay? But God's end-time judgment let's consider God's end-time judgment breaking into current history. Proper interpretation of Israel's laws requires an understanding of some unusual examples of God's judgment. Even before the establishment of Israel as a nation, there were some examples of God's judgment suddenly breaking into history and bringing swift retribution to human sinfulness. Well, think about the flood and Noah's Ark, Sodom and Gomorrah, the destruction of Canaan by the people of Israel is another example recorded in the book of Joshua. This was all carried out under God's direction and was part of his plan for establishing his people in the land that he promised. It also foreshadowed God's ultimate judgment on the whole earth. But you know what it shouldn't do? That should not be the pattern for civil governments to imitate today. Do you want civil government getting the idea that we need to go into that land and conquer it? No, you don't. You know what those were called? Know what that was called? The Crusades. The Crusades. What happened in the Crusades is the direct result of bad theology and bad government. Thinking it was a theocracy ordained of God, and when you start thinking that way, you start reading in the Old Testament what God did with Israel, and you start thinking, well, that's what we need to do. And that's where it came from, and God never intended it to be that way. You see how much of a big deal this is? We have in the Old Testament, under the Levitical law, extensive application of the death penalty. Proper interpretation of Israel's laws requires understanding of another unique aspect of the laws of Israel, namely the death penalty. The death penalty was for much more than murder. Now, in Genesis 9, to all people, God gave capital punishment for what? What reason? Murder. That's it. Now, later, with Israel, the death penalty is far more expansive. The death penalty was instituted for false religion, rebellion against family authority. We'd have a bunch of dead kids. All right? A variety of sexual sins. And look, I'm not saying, by the way, we're not saying that kids should be disobedient, and we're not saying that sexual sins are okay. They're not. But we're not going to carry out the death penalty for them. But yet, that's what the Old Testament calls for. Why? Because Israel was unique. They were to be a holy people of priests unto him. Completely different than our government and our society today. God has not called us to be that in that sense. Okay, so it's completely different. These and other examples of the death penalty were part of Israel's identity as a holy nation before God. But that does not mean that nations today which do not exist as theocracies or as holy nations before God, it does not mean they should not attempt to follow. It does not mean that they should attempt to follow these examples. In fact, Old Testament historical narrative shows that such severe laws and penalties could not create a truly holy people. In other words, it didn't work. It didn't create a holy people. Why? Because laws don't change hearts. Laws never change hearts. Severe penalties for religious infractions, family rebellion, sexual sins should not be used as a pattern for governments today. I'm not saying these things are right, but I'm saying that we shouldn't have severe punishments for them. And by the way, there are societies in Europe and in Middle Ages and times that tried to do this sort of thing. And it didn't go well. If these distinctions are kept in mind, the laws of God that were given to Israel can still provide useful information for understanding the purpose of government and the nature of good and bad government. And if the laws that God gave to his people were an amazing model of how justice, fairness, compassion for the poor and the oppressed and genuine holiness can work out in our daily life. But although specific provisions of the Mosaic Law were intended to apply directly to only Israel at that time, other portions of the Old Testament are not addressed specifically to the Jewish people, but they speak in general terms about governments and kings. Proverbs, for example, Proverbs has 32 verses that mention a king. Not the king, not Israel, but a king. Psalms and Ecclesiastes add more. There's a lot in the Old Testament that talk about what leadership within governments should be. It's just you can't go back to the Levitical law, Exodus through Deuteronomy, and start looking at what government should be. You're going to get messed up if you do that. These verses give additional wisdom about civil government that we will consider later. Now, let's ask this question. What about the Sabbath command? When we consider Christians influencing government, sometimes you ask whether government should, force some of should government dictate that Sundays should be no work? Or should government dictate that? That's a question. Because you have the New Testament application of the Sabbath is Saturday. It's one of the Ten Commandments, which only one of the Ten Commandments not reiterated in the New Testament is keeping the Sabbath. But the Sabbath was a ceremonial law, and like laws about animal sacrifice, we don't have to obey that. The Sabbath was Saturday, but this does lead to this question: should governments require things to be closed on Sundays? I remember the blue laws, all right? Yeah, so that really restricted things being open on Sundays. And so, all right, is that the government's job to do? You know, I don't think that it is. I don't think the government should require. I think you should give that up to the individual people to decide. That's what I think. Because, as we're going to learn about later, you know what the Bible puts a high price on? Freedom. The right to choose. High price on it. And as much as I want people in church, do I think it's right for the government to tell a company you're not allowed to be open on Sunday? No, I don't. I think that's giving them an authority that they don't really have. I know we had it. Now, does that give the individual owner of a company the right to say, I'm not going to be open on Sunday? Yes, it does. I think that's perfectly fine. I commend like Chick-fil-A and Hobby Lobby and some of these places that we're not going to be open on Sundays. And God blesses them, by the way. Those companies do great. I've given you the numbers, like Chick-fil-A, for example, with a fraction of the stores is one of the top fast food chains in the country, and they have less buildings, and they're open one less day, and they're making as much money, if not more, than most of their competitors. All right? It's really amazing. And it's good. And I think that's a choice. It's also a choice for you. I'm not working Sunday. Why? God comes first. It's a simple choice. Now, I understand, look, we have police and firemen, and like, what were we going to say? Like, no police on Sunday. Yeah, that won't go well. Oh, your house is burning? I'm sorry. We'll get to that Monday. Oh, oh, you're having a heart attack and you need emergency services at the ER, we're closed. Now, we could say, well, for emergency personnel, and that's fine, and that's fine. But I guess it would come back to, well, what do we have a biblical argument to say that government should dictate that businesses should be closed? And I don't know that I can find a biblical argument that government should dictate that. You could say, well, that promotes the good of a society for people to be in church. Fine, but are most people in church? No. So it's kind of a faltering argument. So what I say is it's upon the individual to honor the Lord's day. And when you could do X, Y, or Z on the Lord's day, but you choose to give it to God, I think that's of greater value. And it proves your devotion to Him, because you could go work, or you could do this, or you could do that. But no. I saw this article, and I really liked it, that church ought to be your excuse for missing things, not things being your excuse for missing church. Oh, I'd love to do that, but I can't. I got church. Why? It's God's the priority, okay? And so, but like, again, I mean, this is an opinion. I just don't know where in the Bible I can derive the concept that businesses should be closed on Sundays from the Scriptures. Now, if I were a business owner, my business would be closed on Sundays. Why? I want to honor the Lord. So I have that right. But I don't think I have jurisdiction to tell Joe over here, who owns a business, who doesn't care a thing about God, that he's sinning by being open on Sundays. I don't know that I can do that. He's got a lot bigger problems than being open on Sundays. He's on his way to hell. All right? What's that? Hell's open on Sundays. That's right. It is. I mean, look, and there may be difference of opinion in that, but I just believe that I find that believers need to prioritize the Lord. They need to schedule their life around the relationship with God. I just told somebody yesterday, hey, you know what you need to do? You need to schedule your life and put God in it. That's your problem. You don't have God in your life, in your everyday life, and you need to rework some things and put God in it. And make church a priority. A believer should subject their work schedule to their church schedule. And again, that's not always possible in certain fields, I understand. But I do believe that the Lord does as well. But ultimately, it's a soul liberty issue of whether you work or not on a Sunday. But listen, if you're never in church, it's not to your benefit. It shocks me how much people will sell out God for. Shocks me how little. And what I mean by that, it's like, oh, but I'm getting paid whatever to work. So what, $100 is really worth it? Well, I'm getting time and a half. Okay, whatever. I don't care. You're telling me that the amount of money that you're going to make for doing that job on the Lord's day, sit down, and after you take all the taxes out of it, look at how much you actually bring home. And there's your dollar amount. And God is worth less than that. Again, I'm not talking emergency personnel. I'm just talking you have the choice of, I'd rather be at church, I'd rather be working than at church because I need to make that money. Okay, well, how much money do you really need to make? How much did you make? I don't know. And honestly, I don't even care what the number is. Oh, it's $1,000. Okay. Is $1,000 really that much? For some of us, we say, oh, man, $1,000. $1,000 is nothing to God. Absolutely nothing. It's not worth it. No job is worth sacrificing your relationship with God. All right? And so if you're out of church content, and of course none of you are because you're here, but I'm just saying in general, if a job is going to take you out of church completely, it's not worth it. It's just not worth it. I don't care what it pays. So, and by the way, I've been without a job and turned down jobs because I was going to miss services. When I didn't have a job and I was married and had children. And I didn't know how I was going to pay bills. But I said, I'm going to put God first. And you know what? God always took care of me. So you may not agree with me on some of these things I say, but I've lived it, I've done it, and I stand by it. Right? Jen had a job when we first got in church. She was an assistant manager at CVS. And they told her she'd have to work every third Sunday. That turned into working every 3 Sundays. And she couldn't make Wednesday nights either because where she was working was too far away. So she was in service 1 day a month for the first several months that we were in church. I was there all the time, and she was never there. And we're so thankful for a couple, Hamiltons, Scott and Janice. I don't know where they live now, but out in the Midwest somewhere, right? Pennsylvania. Anyhow, they were our Sunday school teachers. They did discipleship with us. And Janice was a sweet, sweet spoken lady, and they were about 10 years older than us. And she said to Jen very nicely, she said, that job doesn't care about you. You could leave it, and they'll have you replaced the next week. You're worried about upsetting them. They don't care about you. And so she put in her note. We talked about it. She put in her notice. And a month later, she had another job working 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, making the same money. Yeah, she made good money. She made more money than I did. And so, I mean, you know, God took care of her. And so, anyhow, at the end of the day, it's a choice. All right? It's a choice you need to make. Now, let's work out perfectly. We're out of time, and I actually was at a breaking point. And I didn't even plan it. Didn't even try to okay, I got to draw this thing out, or I got to wrap it up quick. I wasn't even looking at the clock. And I was like, oh, we're about to get a new section. How much time do I have left? I look up, none. So, good lesson for today. You're dismissed till service time. Oh, good.